Today, I'm really pleased to be here with Dr. Victor Roy, who is both a family physician and sociologist who completed his residency training right here at BU's Boston Medical Center. And I think we'll be going back and doing some work there tomorrow. Some overnight shifts, he mentions. He did his doctorate in sociology at Cambridge on a Gates Cambridge scholarship and is one of the few MD PhDs in the discipline of sociology today, alongside Nicholas Christakis at Yale and Jonathan Metzl at Vanderbilt. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the National Clinician Scholars Program at Yale University and director of the new Health and Political Economy Project that is a multi-institutional partnership between the New School, Penn, and CUNY. Dr. Roy is also author of the new book, which is why he's here today, Capitalizing a Cure: How Finance Controls the Price and Value of Medicine, published by University of California Press. I have used this in my classes already. It's a fantastic book that has had wide-ranging impacts in policy already. It's a great pleasure. Please help me to welcome Victor Roy.
Okay. Well, thanks again for having me as part of the Global Health Politics Workshop. It's exciting to be able to share some of the work that I've done here. I'll just start off by saying, like Joe shared, I'm a family doctor and a sociologist. And one of the ways I came to this work that I'm going to be talking with you about is obviously as a physician, wanting to see the fruits of biomedical innovation actually help my patients. And I came to this project at a time where I had spent time learning about the HIV/AIDS movement in the 90s and the 2000s. And came across the start of my doctoral studies, yet another breakthrough that wasn't getting to patients. And so I'm going to share with you about kind of the set of questions that I came to in the course of this research, and it led me to a field of studying finance, which is not what I expected to study as a doctor, but that's part of the beauty of research. You sometimes end up in places you didn't think you would be. And so I'm going to start off by referring to finance and Joseph Schumpeter. He was a political economist in the 30s who talked about finance at this time, going back almost 100 years, referring to money markets or banks as the headquarters of capitalism. And what he was referring to in describing banks as the headquarters of capitalism is that banks, essentially, by taking deposits and then making loans, were creating the credit that allowed for innovation, because innovation requires capital, and banks could be a source of that. And so in many ways, Schumpeter is known for his theories of innovation, and he described banks as being critical to that. Of course, fast forward 100 years in the financial sector, and the many different kinds of actors that now exist point to a very different kind of link between capital and innovation. And I'm going to describe a little bit of that to you. And part of my argument in this talk is to say that this transformation of thinking about banks as the headquarters of capitalism to how financial sector today operates actually has something to do with whether people have healthy livers or have hepatitis C. And I know that might feel like a wild link to be making, but I'm going to try and bring the financial sector down to the level of the liver. And I'm going to try and say this has something that we should, that there are lessons here for even looking at global health politics, right? So what I'm going to do in the course of this talk is set the scene for the book, share 3 frames for analyzing what's described in the sociological literature. I'm going to link it to this case, this phenomenon of financialization, why financialization might matter for global health politics, and then discuss, since we are here at the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, figured I needed to talk a little bit about potential futures and the implications of some of the dynamics I talk about. So this is the summer of 2015. I'm in this case, I'm in South Los Angeles. And there's a lot of hope in the air in this community health center, because they have 70 patients with hepatitis C, and there's a new curative treatment that had been launched in the 18 months before this. And there was a lot of hope that this treatment could benefit these patients, but there was also a lot of frustration in the air because only one had been able to get access to the treatment. And so and this was something that was playing out, interestingly, not only in many middle-income countries, and we'll get into what happened in low-income countries, but also happening in a place like the US in South Los Angeles. So to understand what was at play here, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hep C and then the controversy that kind of unfolded. So hepatitis C, it's a deadly virus that injures the liver. It's transmitted via the blood. Injecting drug use in a prior era transfusions were a big part of transmitting Hep C before we screened for that. And it's a disease that injures the liver over time. It's not like COVID or even HIV, which untreated can lead to mortality in a very short time horizon, but it does kill a lot of people through basically ultimately a really terrible end-stage liver failure, which is a very terrible way to end. There's older treatments that were toxic with lower cure rates. Okay, at the time we're talking about a decade ago. Now, Hep C impacts large numbers in the US and globally. So, the numbers might be even higher than the 2.4 million. It might be as high as 4 million. There's a large number of people in the US. Globally, the WHO puts the number somewhere around $70 million range. And so now it's about 2014, and these sofosbuvir-based medicines were first approved in December of 2013. They're manufactured by Gilead Sciences, and they're offering cure rates north of 90%. And so this is, really a major breakthrough, but there's a catch. These were priced at over $90,000 for a 3-month regimen, so they became dubbed the $1,000 a day pill. Because for one pill over 3 months, it costs $90,000. It wasn't marketing that Gilead expected to get, but that's how it was dubbed. They actually thought it was going to be a convenient way to kind of price, but of course didn't anticipate. Their marketing department could have anticipated this. What happened? Well, predictably, there were restrictions around who could access the treatments, because from a government perspective, the large number of people that have the Hep C multiplied by that price point meant that there were significant fiscal consequences. And so the responses by, for example, Medicaid programs in the US was to ration the treatment. Essentially, you had to qualify for the treatment by having advanced liver disease, right? So we were going to let people actually progress further in their disease course before they were going to get access to the treatment. These are some headlines. I refer to the international piece in a slide later, but this kind of a phenomenon happened in many other countries around the world at the time. It was so controversial and that the Senate Finance Committee, one of the most powerful bodies in the US Senate, launched a bipartisan investigation with Chuck Grassley and Ron Wyden. What was interesting to me is that there was this shifting justifications that were being made for pricing. And we're leading to kind of headlines like this. Each of these hepatitis C pills cost $1,000. That's actually a great deal. And the reason what was happening is, traditionally, you've probably already heard this kind of an argument that prices are set based on how much it costs to do research and development, right? And we give patents to companies as kind of a social contract so that then they can recoup the costs of R&D. Here, there was a completely different kind of argument being made, that actually the prices reflected the tremendous social and economic value that this would have for society by curing patients, by being able to avert downstream disease, hospitalizations, liver transplants that were needed because of Hep C. By curing it, we were ostensibly saving society money and also creating more economic value. And so this was actually echoing the pharmaceutical line. So Gilead's executive was like, we shouldn't be talking about price. Value should be the discussion. And so as this was unfolding, I was realizing that the kind of health policy debate wasn't picking up on a set of dynamics that the social scientists had been describing for a while by that point, which is this dynamic of financialization. That in order to understand this $90,000 price point, to understand how value is being debated, we needed to understand the rising power of financial sector actors, motives, and logics in our economy and society. There's a big body of literature in the social sciences. I'm just going to describe it, distill it to 2 points. But essentially, Greta Krippner's work, Capitalizing on Crisis, really showed how the financial sector became a much bigger part of the economy in the late 20th century, displacing manufacturing and service and actually making the financial sector become having a much bigger share of overall corporate profits in the economy. And this over time, the growth of the financial sector ends up morphing businesses themselves, right? That actually, this is Gerald Davis's work, corporate financialization changes the motives that businesses operate to being oriented much more around short-term financial market metrics rather than kind of the internal operations of and investments that firms need to make. And other potential stakeholders that could be involved in a company's business, like workers and communities. And so the question broadly here that I was asking is, how do these dynamics that are being described in social science literature shape the ways drugs are made, priced, and valued? And in particular, using the Hep C case as kind of a case study into that. I'll just very briefly tell you, my approach was to kind of build a sociological case study looking at how the drugs were developed, the R&D process, and the policy struggle over the access. So this was a story that pretty much goes from the mid-1990s into the mid-2010s. I drew on science and technology studies, political economy, economic and medical sociology's evaluation, and then I triangulated between multiple data sources. I'll just highlight two of the interesting ones. The USN investigation released about 1,500 pages of internal corporate documents during my dissertation, which I got lucky with. And then there were earnings calls transcripts. That was a really interesting source of data that helped me understand the relationship between the company and the financial sector, because it was literally conversations between Wall Street investment analysts and corporate leaders. And so I'm not going to go through the entire book. I'm going to talk about 3 analytic frames that I think are interesting and hopefully will be frames that you might find useful in even wildly different areas of work related to health or even other kind of social domains. But I'm talking about how knowledge is turned into financial assets, how value is constructed around maximizing shareholder value in ways that aren't always made explicit in the debate, and thinking a little bit about power as hegemony and the ways in which this operates to kind of create a status quo kind of scenario. So let me turn to the first one, knowledge as financial assets. So I'll tell you the brief story behind how the drugs were developed. Pharmasset was a company that was founded by a publicly funded researcher at Emory. He had years of funding through the VA and the National Institutes of Health, and he co-founded Pharmasset in the late 90s. Pharmasset eventually spun out, raises venture capital, and is listed on NASDAQ after an IPO. And that's when the company ends up developing the compound sofosbuvir. And I'm just going to fast forward to 2011. I go through all these steps in much more detail in the book, but Pharmasset's a company that by that point has spent, you can see north of 270 million on research and development. They have no products or revenues, but a dynamic that is very common to contemporary finance capitalism. You can guess what their valuation is, $8 billion. And that, I'm going to use this as a kind of an example of trying to get into like this kind of relationship, maybe the lack of relationship, right, between actually what it's spending on research and development and its valuation at $8 billion. And one of the things to understand here around financial value in this ecosystem is to actually understand assets and this process of assetization. So assetization is described by certain anthropologists and social scientists as the transformation of, and sociologists as the transformation of property. This could be intangible, like knowledge, or tangible, like owning a factory, into a future earnings stream, right? And so this is a body of work that is inspired in part by economists that were writing about these dynamics 100 years ago, like Thorsten Veblen, who described kind of the capital as fundamentally a question of who could own and control as many assets in a community as possible, right? And that's actually really what capital is trying to do, and especially in these kinds of sectors where, in particular, knowledge development is very capital intensive. So you're trying to be able to acquire assets for their future value. And of course, in biomedical research and innovation, research and development, we've seen since the 1980s a whole political, legal, economic processes that enable the turning of kind of publicly developed knowledge into financial assets. So this is just a diagram of the actual compound pharmaceut. I trace it further in the book, the kind of public sources of research and development that went into the making of the compound, though ultimately, the company Pharmaset, a private enterprise, is able to take this knowledge and turn it into a product. And one of the key things to understand is that assets actually have very different value, I argue, and pricing logics than commodities. So you often hear about the commodification of healthcare. I actually think we need to think a little bit more about the assetization of health and healthcare. And here's why. So commodities, they get their value from the exchange process, right? You pay something for getting something in return. Assets actually derive their value from owning something, right? Not about exchange. It's about being able to own something for their future earnings stream. And this creates really interesting pricing dynamics. In commodities, where prices actually fall when additional producers can detect that there's increased demand, right? So that attracts more producers, and ideally in a functioning market, more competition, prices fall over time. Assets, because of the scarcity involved with the ownership and control over a given asset, the more demand there is for an asset, the price appreciates, right? Think about asset bubbles, think about housing. And so you have these dynamics in biomedical research and development where small biotech companies, right, all of a sudden are valued at really high price points because there's a sense that the compounds that they are developing might be very valuable. I will make a point around the $8 billion valuation. One of the things that's really important to point out is that public investments are actually critical to the value creation process. And the venture capitalists that are involved in this process know this. So this is Luke Evnin, who was one of the investors behind Pharmaset. He was saying, due to the NIH funding now also going towards programs that demonstrate commercial potential, our startups are much further along by the time we invest, even though they might be straight out of academia, right? Saying that, as a venture capitalist, it's really beneficial that public money and public investment can go so far in certain therapeutic areas to really de-risk their own investments. And so this is a paper that, and I go into more of the narrative around this, that describes the public funding behind sofosbuvir. And this is part of a much broader literature that Mariana Mazzucato has written about The Economist, about the entrepreneurial state, right? The government investments that go into many of our innovations, including all the things that make our iPhone smart. So coming back to the other piece, so the public investment piece is really critical, but the other piece that's really important to how you get price points for a company like Pharmaset at $8 billion is the way that we've created the pricing mechanism with new breakthrough treatments, is that each generation of treatments sets the floor for the next launch. So this is just a diagram showing the pricing data from Europe, actually, from Switzerland, but it could well be replicated in the US. And this, along the x-axis, is showing cure rates that get better and better. And each bar represents a new generation of the hepatitis C treatments. And essentially, what this study found is that for every 1% increase in cure rates with each generation of treatment that got better, the launch price for the next generation went up by about $1,000. Under the argument that we've got a better treatment, so we should be willing to pay more for it. But you can see why over time that creates certain challenges. This anticipation, of course, of the higher prices and the valuations, it fuels a whole range of speculation by a chain of financial actors that I describe in the book, from venture capitalists that are involved more in the earlier stages of the risk-taking process, to actors like hedge funds. So I'll just say, one of the hedge funds that made a lot of money on this was QVT, and the hedge fund person that was making those bets on Hep C compounds is Vivek Ramaswamy, who you might know ran in the Republican primary. And some of his wealth comes directly from the case that I'm describing. And he took out stakes in a lot of the Hep C companies that ended up being bought out by big pharmaceutical companies. Now, for these financial actors, the focus, right, isn't on carrying a research and development process all the way from beginning to end. The focus from the very beginning is on the exit, and that's pretty explicit. And even Ray Shanazi, the founder of Pharmaset, he describes this. He said, I coined the name. It's actually pharmaceutical assets, right? Pharmaset. And the idea was to create assets that would be sold to companies. That was the initial business plan. Okay, so hopefully that bit about assets helps you understand a little bit more about kind of valuation processes that are at play. But now I'm going to actually talk to you, share a little bit about how value kind of gets constructed in this process, and argue that it's very connected to maximizing shareholder value. And here's how. So Gilead, I'm going to turn to Gilead now. Gilead is a very financially successful business by 2011. They've got $8 billion in revenue, $10 billion in cash on hand. Their profit margins are great, all off of HIV/AIDS, right? These are their treatments that they're making their money on. The problem is that their stock price is pretty much stagnant. And Wall Street worries that as its earlier galloping growth begins to slow, investors are starting to wonder what Gilead plans to do for a second act. So this is really interesting, right? Like a financially, ostensibly a successful business with good revenues, good profit margins, but there's a question about ultimately what I'll describe as the problem of growth, right? Because that is the challenge these companies are facing, and how to generate that growth on kind of an ongoing basis. So to kind of get into this, I'm going to develop a very toy model of like how to follow capital through these publicly traded companies. And then that'll help me explain kind of the dynamics that Gilead was facing. So you've got a healthcare company like Gilead. It produces products, services, technologies. Payers, including government and households, pay for the value that these products offer. That money can be reinvested back into research and development, manufacturing, workers, and some portion of it can go to shareholders. And I'm going to focus in on this bit about what gets distributed to shareholders, because this is where the logic of maximizing shareholder value that William Lozanic and Mary O'Sullivan have described, and I'm sure all of you are aware of and know about, really has important implications. And how companies today distribute capital to shareholders primarily comes through either dividends, which is some amount of money for every share that is owned, to another form of distribution that was really only made legal in the open markets in 1982. Prior to this, it was thought of as more of financial market kind of manipulation. But the idea that companies can use their capital to buy their own stocks. And what this does is it improves the earnings per share ratio because you're reducing the denominator, right? The number of shares. By doing that, you are able to improve at least that metric that is very much used in trading decisions, right? And on Wall Street, and it makes the value of your share look higher or be more valuable, and hopefully that'll improve the share price. And so, studies have shown over the last decade, for example, from 2021 back, companies have spent $87 billion more on buybacks and dividends than they did on R&D at the sector level. And so, there are many arguments in favor of why we should maximize shareholder value, particularly the argument being that companies would either waste that capital on unproductive projects, which we can talk about. There are others that argue that this drives executives to pursue short-term profits rather than will make long-term investments. It drives higher prices, and it rewards financial actors that don't actually invest in the value-creating capabilities of a company or an R&D process, right? Primarily, it's benefiting people that are trading off of a share price rather than actually making investments that go to real labor around an innovation process. And so this has raised this has definitely raised, especially share buybacks in particular, have gotten a lot of political attention, though there hasn't necessarily been action on the other side. But these are obviously three people that don't agree on much, but it's been headlines over the last 4 or 5 years. And the question here, coming back to this case of R&D and Gilead, the question is shareholder-oriented growth, right? The idea that not only do companies need to deliver profits, but growth year in and year out to shareholders is it compatible with research and development that takes long time horizons? Speaking of the long run future, it can take 10 to 15 years. And if you're trying to generate growth in that time frame, that creates real challenges for companies, actually. And so, Kaushik Sundararajan in his book Pharmacracy describes how pharmaceutical companies actually almost get structurally incentivized to become acquisition specialists, right? Instead of making those bets internally within your firm, to actually acquire companies that have already developed a product to a further more advanced stage. So Gilead's CEO tells Wall Street, we typically like things where we can have an impact on phase 3 and where we can accelerate those products either into the approval process or into greater indications after the approval process. And so Gilead, at that point, I described right in 2011, they're looking at their growth stagnating, even though they have healthy profit margins, and they spend a big share of their accumulated capital from HIV/AIDS treatment to buy Pharmasset for $11 billion. At the time, it was one of the highest acquisition prices for a biotech company. I'm going to fast forward. The company ends up launching the treatments. And just to describe, like, where did the capital go that the company ended up generating from their Hep C acquisition? So they made $46.4 billion in 3 years. It was, at the time, before the COVID vaccines, the most profitable drug launch in history. And this is just a diagram, or this is just a graph showing. I'm just going to distill the point here, so you don't have to go through the graph here. But they direct 33 billion of that to shareholders. 26 billion in buybacks, a portion of that, less than basically 3 times as much they spent on R&D in that same time frame. And of course, who are some of the major shareholders in the firm, right? It's the senior executives. And so over those 3 years, the 5 executives make over $1 billion on the Hep C treatments. So it's important to understand the managers, right? A part of this whole regime has been created by making the managers important shareholders in the company themselves. So it incentivizes some of the strategies I've just described. And so if you look at some of how the chief R&D officer for Gilead describes the company's strategy, he makes it really explicit to Wall Street. If you look back at the last 6 years, it's been remarkable. We have done many, many deals, right? And he lists off all the acquisitions, and yet we were able to return 70% of our free cash flow to shareholders. So I think that is a good way to think about our future. So this is not a description of here are the products we have in our pipeline, here are the new technologies we're working on. It's a story about acquisitions and then distributing the capital to shareholders. And there's actually many, many quotes. I just pulled one, but kind of describing this as the strategy. It's very different than kind of the mid-century version that George Merck described of his of Merck, where he was on the cover of Time magazine talking about medicine is for the people, not for profits. And so a different conception for what the pharmaceutical company is supposed to be about. Mariana Mazzucato, just to wrap up this section on value, has written, we have made it easier for some to call themselves value creators and in the process extract value. So I'm going to finish with this last section on power as hegemony. How am I doing? Okay, a little bit of time here. And kind of describe, like, how does this come to be, right? And I'm going to come back to Kaushik Sundararajan's work on hegemony. He describes it as the establishment of a new common sense. Of course, he's invoking Gramsci here in describing kind of how ideas around value be taken for granted in this space. Just to come back, so how did Gilead actually price these treatments? Just to get a bit more specific, this is right from their own documents. So they say, their prices build directly on the current prices, right? So we want to charge a value premium because it's a better treatment, increased tolerability, shorter treatment duration. So we're going to be able to charge a little bit more than the already baseline treatments. They recognize, however, that given that there will be a much larger number of patients, the volume will be much bigger because it's a curative treatment, that this is going to create some controversy, right? So they map out, they're good stakeholder, they're good at mapping stakeholders. And so they actually hire consultants that actually map out what will be the reaction from different stakeholders at different price points. And so they even model for the likelihood of a letter from Congress, the likelihood of a congressional hearing, and the different reactions from different kinds of groups. Okay, and as you get more towards the right side, they're worried that there's going to be more likelihood of that kind of reaction, which is why they don't price it at like 135,000, which is like, the prices that they were kind of looking at in terms of the range all the way down to, 50, 60, $70,000. But here's the thing, there's an interesting set of, an important set of literature that is very much part of our health policy and public health decision-making, which is cost effectiveness analysis. The cost effectiveness analysis shows that even priced at the price points that I've described, and Gilead is charging at the time, these are actually cost-effective treatments because of the huge benefit they offer to society. And there's a whole range of papers that come out describing how these treatments are cost-effective. And this literature is kind of summed up by this health policy professor. Is the important thing to remember at Pittsburgh about cost-effectiveness is that something that is really expensive can still be cost-effective if it is really, really effective, right? Going back to that value argument. And these drugs are very, very effective. And so this is really interesting because I saw this debate happen over and over again in seminar rooms and policy rooms where the liver specialists were saying, well, the cancer doctors, they get their treatments approved and they're only extending life by 6 months, a year sometimes. And they're paying, government's paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for these cancer treatments. I'm able to cure my patient. Why isn't government paying for these treatments, right? And it's a very kind of rational argument to be making around how we allocate resources. And so part of the work here that I trace is actually from Joseph Dumit's work on the kind of, and this is only one part of the book, but the kind of the social construction of this idea of cost effectiveness. He traces the post-war era of basically post-war clinical biomedicine and the development of all these studies, right, and forms of analysis, doing long-term clinical studies, clinical trials, clinical epidemiology, and then the advent of a field that didn't exist, right, 50 or 60 years ago, pharmacoeconomic studies. And he describes this idea of how this transforms our idea of illness from something that's felt, right? We go to a doctor, get a medication because we're feeling sick, to being able to treat a statistical illness, right? We get treated for hypertension before we feel any effects of it because it will create some benefit in the future, which is a good thing from a prevention level at a from a population standpoint. What he describes is how this is able to be turned into a kind of an economic value, right? By preventing this downstream statistical illness, there is an argument to be made that this produces a certain kind of economic value. And part of my contention in the book is less that this is good or bad. And in many ways, actually, these are important tools that as a society, we think about making decisions around assessing new technologies to be able to assign comparative, to be able to understand what the comparative benefits of different allocations of resources could be. What's really interesting to me is the ways in which this entire body of work kind of helps establish a common sense view of what these prices should be for these treatments and how Gilead kind of appropriates this rationality, right? And so Gilead is telling Wall Street, as they're facing a lot of political pressure from Congress, there are publications out there, not by Gilead, but by respected people in the field who can start these conversations in more of an academic, collegial way. And again, the chief research officer, scientific officer says, we're putting all this together into a bigger pharmacoeconomic argument. And it does turn out that part of the people making these arguments are esteemed colleagues at universities, right? Professors that have academic prestige. Some of them will actually list their disclosures and will make these arguments for, that are aligning up with Gilead's argument here as well. ProPublica later did an investigative piece looking at how companies were paying professors to help land some of these pieces, and sometimes, in many cases, not always disclosing those conflicts of interest. But I trace this to, there's this landmark important National Academy of Medicine report looking at trying to actually eliminate hepatitis C, because now we have a curative treatment. We could actually eliminate this viral infectious disease. But the group concluded in 2016, though eliminating the public health problem would be feasible, it would require near universal access to treatment, something that appears unfeasible given the current pricing and policy environment. And so I think part of the environment is some of what I've just described. And so the argument really comes down to, in the book, how value becomes untethered from maximizing access in public health and really fastened to financial markets and strategies of growth, speculation, extraction. I will say this story played out differently internationally. There were, but it is part of the same story that I can get into more in the Q&A. But basically, you know, I describe in chapter 3 how Gilead kind of is able to segment the kind of global market, one into a kind of a licensing strategy for low-income countries, having learned from the HIV kind of experience and the blowback that happened around that. But they strategically excluded many of the middle-income countries that had high levels of hepatitis C, and pursued kind of this value pricing strategy in those countries, including, and of course they also engaged in that kind of a strategy in many countries in Europe and in the US. In many of those settings, ultimately government had more negotiating power to be able to bargain for different kinds of deals. Whereas in the US, we still, 10 years later, the prices have come down, I will say, for a couple different factors, but we still see significant rationing. One interesting thing that a dynamic that came about was, you know, in terms of the response to this strategy was this idea of buyers clubs, right? So you had citizens organizing to try and get generics from India to actually get the access in places like Australia before they had widespread access. And like I said, some countries did use negotiating power for creative deals or try and pursue, you know, compulsory licensing strategies to try and get access to generics that could be used as part of elimination campaigns. Egypt is one of the most interesting cases because the country has high levels of Hep C because of iatrogenic spread of the disease from a mass vaccination campaign and the 70s, I believe. And so they were actually, Gilead was able to strike a deal ultimately with Egypt to get access to generics after Egypt did not want to grant intellectual property protections to the company. And so in that country, the prices are set $1,000. It was more like $1,000 for a regimen instead of $90,000. And so they engaged in a public health campaign, a public health initiative, and able to really scale up access to treatment. Between those 6 years, they'd screened more than 50 million people and treated more than 4 million. So really interesting. In the US, so fast forward to just, you know, this recent data, 15,000 people continue to die about every year. This is data from 2018 to 2020. Francis Collins is trying to lead an initiative to try and really address this. His brother-in-law passed away from Hep C, and he wrote in the New York Times just last year, "We're squandering one of the most important medical advances of the 21st century." And prices are at least one important part of this story. One really important experiment that has happened in the US and a BU professor, Rina Kanti, has been part of this experiment where learning from other cases like Australia, we're able to basically negotiate what's been called a subscription model or a Netflix model, where basically governments offer a lump sum payment in exchange for unlimited access to that treatment for a period of time. And that lump sum payment is basically the amount of money that the government has for Hep C that they can afford. And that incentivizes health systems to actually go out and screen and treat as many people as possible. And the reason that a company like Gilead ultimately ended up coming to the table on this is the idea that, you know, these are not patients that they're making any money off of anyways, because there isn't access. So they're generating some revenue in the process, and revenue that is like secure and knowable in terms of their own forecasting. So this has been proposed to be scaled up to a national level to create a national subscription model to create a Hep C elimination program. So just to go back to these 3 analytic frames I talked about, right? So knowledge as financial assets, I would say that, you know, in your own domain that you think about with health, it's interesting to think about what's being turned into, you know, data, for example, as financial assets. So I left that spot blank. Value is maximizing shareholder value, and power has hegemony. There's a couple last things here I'll just describe, you know, in terms of why financialization might matter for global health politics. You know, I have an article on this more that relates to the US, but This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I had a chance to first co-author this with Joe Brush at U of Chicago with our colleague Colleen Grogan there. And it was really exciting that the New England Journal of Medicine actually was kind of interested in this idea that I've spent some time describing, and I'll just want to make a finer point of kind of how to understand this dynamic of financialization. There's a lot of text on the slide, but I kind of we compare financialization in part to corporatization and privatization as a kind of a little bit of a different dynamic that builds on these other dynamics, but also departs from it by really specifically referring to the financial sector ownership and logics and actors in which basically public and private properties is transformed into these financial assets. And the ways in which from these assets, capital is accumulated and distributed to financial actors and markets. And this is something that's not just happening in the US. We're seeing, private equity actors enter into other markets. This is just a headline from a decade ago in India, but also they're identifying places in which there's opportunity to actually own parts of health systems. And then in the global scene, we're seeing financial actors and different kinds of financial instruments really seen as kind of an alternative to public finance and an alternative to political processes at national and international level. So this whole movement around how to do blended finance, how to make billions turn into trillions. And a lot of that involves how does public money blended as part of financial instruments can leverage private capital to turn into trillions. The promise of a lot of this hasn't really necessarily borne out. And there are certain costs that I think are really important to look at. And ultimately, I think the questions that are important when we're looking at financialization is just who bears the risks, who get the rewards in the process. I think how do strategies of extraction get naturalized, and kind of what are the countervailing powers to create alternatives? Let's see, do I have a few minutes to talk about futures? I know we're right by time. Okay, I'll finish up here. I'm gonna come back to this case of, I just kind of tried to zoom out on financialization a little bit. I'm gonna come back to the case of treatments and drugs, because I think a really concrete case of how some of this plays out. So, what are the potential futures for access to medicines? We see, new treatments. This is a headline from New York Times last year. This is a treatment for spinal muscular dystrophy that affects kids. This is a picture from Brazil, where pharmaceutical companies are actually using the right to health in the constitution in Brazil to argue for why these treatments that are priced in the millions, this is north of $1 million, actually priced at that price point in Brazil. And you can imagine, the Brazilian government having to decide whether to vaccinate more people from COVID or to offer, a small number of kids this treatment, and how politically contentious that would be, and how the kind of choices that are confronting governments with this kind of dynamic around breakthrough treatments that are being priced at levels that we haven't seen before, that are becoming kind of the new norm. There are some that say, this is just to propose, just to provoke, that we should kind of double down on this whole dynamic of financialization. We should actually create mortgages for medicines. So this is a group of financial engineers at MIT who came up with, this is a paper, Buying Cures versus Renting Health, where they have this mechanism in which mortgages could be used essentially to pay for these treatments, particularly those that are curative in nature. They do admit that a law mandating full coverage for curative therapies and allowing for price negotiation would likely be economically more efficient, more sustainable, and socially more acceptable than a purely private sector solution. But this is where we're at, right, in terms of thinking about how to create access around this kind of a dynamic. Of course, even in the US, there are very sharp alternatives. I talked about the Louisiana case of an experiment, but look at what the VA has done, right? The VA is a national health system within the US. And if you look at for veterans, the red line there in terms of people awaiting treatment really dropped off. And the number of people ever treated, the green line, skyrocketed once they were able to do kind of mass treatment of veterans. And we see equity across the number of veterans, across veterans who've been treated. been really able to reach all the different kinds of veterans that have Hep C and need treatment. So here's kind of the alternative to coming up with mortgages for medicines. And so, I think part of what I describe in the final part of the book is to think about alternatives. We're going to need to think about public power. And there's been work that's been done on kind of how do we develop a public option for the pharmaceutical in the pharmaceutical industry. So are there specific instances in which government should be involved in actually manufacturing essential medicines? So California has just launched a manufacturing initiative called CalRx to manufacture insulin because of the way insulin has been priced over the past many years and how it's affected, honestly, California's own state budget in terms of paying for those treatments. And there's a new agency in the US government called ARPA-H. There's a question of whether, if the government gets involved in actually commercializing technologies, are there ways that the government can be creative about how it either licenses or gets involved in certain aspects of the manufacturing process? And of course, COVID-19 and government involvement with Moderna just raised all these questions even more so. So I'll end by coming back to where I started. We had in South LA in this community health center, only one person on with treatment. I was talking with one of the health workers, and he was describing all the different ways in which they were trying to figure out, on Post-it papers on the wall, how to get access for their patients. And this was one staff person who now is responsible for not only HIV, but now managing access for Hep C treatments and all the knock-on effects that pricing actually has, not just at a policy level, right? This is like real for even health workers and patients, just to figure out, okay, what labs, what paperwork needs to be filled out, so maybe we can get access. And this is part of what the book tries to say shouldn't be the status quo and shouldn't necessarily just be part of what's taken for granted as natural, because they're based on a set of choices we've made about how we've set up the system. So that's what I had. Thank you very much.